Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Abhilash Panda, and I manage the work on financing, de-risking investment, and infrastructure resilience for the UN Office at Disaster Risk Reduction. I'll be moderating this session today with the esteemed list of panel members. And this session is being designed and held in collaboration with colleagues from UNCDF, the African Development Bank, the Arise Network, Government of Mauritius, and the Municipality of Stade Sueste. Before introducing our distinguished panel members, colleagues, and speakers, let me start with putting forward a few facts and points to your attention. Now, the COP26 in Glasgow came to an end recently. Now, it has been a big achievement, I must say, on behalf of the international community, and there has been a lot of effort and investments that have gone into this process of coming to some of these large-scale agreements. Now, under a scenario with 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels by 2030, almost half of the world's population, that's roughly 5 billion people, could be exposed to climate hazards related to heat stress, drought, flood, or water stress in the next decade. Now, last year, 2020 rivaled 2016 as the world's hottest recorded year. Apart from the COVID-19 pandemic, the year was dominated by climate-related disasters. I won't necessarily go into the facts and figures or the values around that, but just for your idea, this has affected roughly 98 odd million people and has created an estimated economic loss of roughly $171 billion. Infrastructure for that part is essential for sustaining the livelihood of communities, protecting the development gains, to providing them with basic services, as well as for providing or ensuring economic stability and growth. However, evidence also shows that existing infrastructure systems across the world, across the regions, and across countries are increasingly affected by natural and man-made hazards. In a recent study, we found out that since 2005, on average, more than 3,200 schools, over 412 more health facilities, more than 3,000 kilometers of road have been damaged or destroyed every year. The number of houses damaged relative to the population growth in almost 20 countries and regions have increased at least sixfold between 2000s and until now. In addition to the risk, the other factors that come into play, the risk driver of urbanization and unsustainable investment decisions have also increased the impact of hazards on infrastructure. In Africa, exposure to hazards and vulnerability to disasters has been reported to be increasing due to, in part, of unplanned urbanization, human settlements, unsustainable land use, and infrastructure stress. According to various reports, I'm not quoting just one, but a few, infrastructure disruptions impose costs between $390 billion and $647 billion per year in low and middle income countries. Now, with all that, and if you take in 2019 a single disastrous event, Cyclone Idai, caused the destruction or flooding of more than 72,000 houses in Mozambique. The loss and disruption of basic services to health centers, to supply chain, access to safe water and sanitation, these are all services being provided by critical infrastructure. That said, a number of countries still invest mostly in disaster response and recovery rather than in risk prevention or building resilience. In a study done by UNDRR and other sister agencies, we estimated that roughly for every $100 spent on development aid in the last 10 years, risk prevention and risk reduction only counts for 47 cents. Now that's 47 cents only for every $100. That said, the obstacles of developing robust and resilient infrastructure are multiple and complex. Short-term thinking, untested assumptions, lack of sufficient data, lack of local institutional capacity, but all in all, the lack of financing at the right time, at the right location, have all been hindrances in addressing and building resilience or long-term resilience. For a long time now, we have been talking about providing the private sector with a meaningful role in risk prevention and disaster risk reduction. The private sector definitely plays a central role in creation or reduction of risk and the resilience of countries. Now, core benefits, bankability, and pipeline of infrastructure projects supported by strong commitment of national governments could actually drive markets, but also get private sector to be engaged. But this all will require bringing various stakeholder groups together and forming that partnership and understanding the risk factors that are happening at the local level. Now, I'll be introducing my panel members now, and then going forward with them by putting forward a few questions that could help us address some of these issues and challenges. But before that, um, let me summarize a few specific areas that we at UNDRR see critical to be addressed when it comes to infrastructure resilience and investments that go into it. One of that is that there is a need to establish overarching benchmarks for resilient infrastructure, which means there's still a lack of understanding of what resilience of infrastructure is and what do we mean by investing in resilience. The second is there is a need to increase and improve data collection for Sendai Framework's Target D, which actually attributes to two sub targets. One is reduction in number of damages to infrastructure, and the second one is reduction in disruption of basic services because of infrastructure damage. The third is we need to promote a think resilience approach to all infrastructure investment. And there we would need to create an enabling policy and investment environment, both with the private sector and looking at the public portfolios. And lastly, we need to include infrastructure resilience in national resilience, disaster risk reduction and resilience strategies. But this would require to develop or update national and local regulations around infrastructure, which take into account resilience measures as well as sustainability as a core factor in that. So that was, in short, a bit of background and looking way forward from my side. And with that, I'll now start going to my esteemed panel members. Today we have five colleagues coming from various parts of the African continent and or functioning and supporting the African continent. We have Ms. Atsuko Toda from the African Development Bank. We have Mr. Supikera, who representing the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Center of Mauritius. We have Mr. Michael Sudarakasa, who is the ARISE Global Board Member. He's also the coordinator of the Southern Africa ARISE Network and the coordinator of PFAN South Africa. Michael will be able to speak a bit more on all of these networks and processes. We have Ms. Tokozil Zulu. She is the director of solid waste from Steve West Municipality of South Africa. And last not least, we have Ms. Sophie de Konikik. She is the Global Climate Facility Manager at the Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility. In short, it's called LOCAL, at the United Nations Capital Development Fund. So that's my panel, but I'll start first with Ms. Toda from the African Development Bank. She is the Director for Agriculture, Finance, and Rural Infrastructure Development. So Ms. Toda, if I may put forward, African Development Bank in one of its report estimates that there is a roughly 20 to 25 billion dollars per year that's required to be invested in basic urban infrastructure, and an additional 20 billion per year in housing to respond to urban population growth. Now, these investments need to be climate proof to ensure sustainable pathway for urban build-up. The bank's role, the African Development Bank's role in supporting infrastructure development is evolving to include emphasis on low carbon urban mobility and the development of resilient, sustainable cities. Now, as an development bank, how do we ensure that investments in infrastructure strengthen resilience, or how do we ensure that infrastructure investments take resilience into account? And if you could also talk a bit about the ambitions of African Development Bank in investing in resilient infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. Ms. Toda, the floor is with you.
Thank you so much, Abhilash. And I'd like to thank the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the organizers for the opportunity to speak, but also for organizing this important panel, as well as all the conversations that are taking place. So first of all, let me thank Abhilash for a lot of good data and a lot of great points that were raised with regards to disaster risk prevention, risk reduction. With regards to bank official data, which was put through on the African Economic Outlook, the new estimates by the African Development Bank suggest that the continent's infrastructure needs are roughly about 130 to 170 billion a year, with a financing gap that can range from anything between 70 billion to about 110 billion. So as was mentioned, let's say that financing gap is around 40% to the cities, then the financing gap is about what was mentioned, 25 to 30 billion. And it's very, very important to say that that does not include housing plus education plus health infrastructure, which would push the urban infrastructure gap well north of 100 billion per annum. So these requirements are huge. As Abhilash has mentioned, my title is Rural Infrastructure Development, so I will speak a bit more to rural infrastructure also to feed Africa's cities. It's very obvious on the African continent that we need to increase productivity, production, value addition, and we need to attract private sector investment into the rural areas. And this requires more than anything else, adequate infrastructure. We are reprioritizing infrastructure based on the following. We focus investment opportunities in supply chains, investing in logistics and transport infrastructure to enhance the resilience of supply chains. So it's not infrastructure anywhere and everywhere, but it's really to look at the supply chains that need to have greater resilience, and therefore what is the infrastructure investment requirements in that. So that's number one. Number two, building infrastructure so that actually the supply chains are made shorter, i.e., particularly when it comes to rural areas, trying to get the infrastructure so that value addition and processing can happen much closer to the production areas. And what that does is actually decreases post-harvest loss and also decreases transport costs of high volume, low value products. And really that economic analysis of what infrastructure would mean to an area is very important. And then thirdly, build infrastructure or focus infrastructure investments in spatially clustered locations. And this really helps for private sector investment, which is an opportunity also to maximize on spillover effects. So it's really about looking at supply chains. What are the infrastructure needs within them? Number two, looking at the area where the infrastructure is required most to locate strategically in much more geospatially clustered areas. And that is really how we're looking at unlocking private sector investment and therefore making the infrastructure much more commercially viable. We call some of our investments in rural infrastructure special agro-industrial processing zones. And this includes everything from roads, reliable electricity, water treatment, and optic fiber. So it's a combination of not just hard, but also soft infrastructure. Currently, a lot of infrastructure is financed through public sector financing. It has been so for the last a couple of decades, but we are looking at ways to mobilize more private sector finance by bringing in the private sector in the form of transaction advisors and their capacities to design, to build, to operate, and to transfer. This is something that we've been really working hard on as we realize that there are efficiency gains, accountability gains, performance gains that also can be made by ensuring that the private sector comes in early at the stage of design, and so that we can actually build a public-private partnership framework that works differently for every country depending on capacity. So those are some of the things that I just wanted to raise from the African Development Bank side. Thank you.
Thank you, Atsuko. That was very interesting to hear you. And some of the figures that you have put also is quite staggering. 40% financing gap. That's huge. And I'm sure the efforts that you're looking forward to will help at least address most of it, if not all. And I think this is more of now a global calling, and it's not just the responsibility of one institution. We need to bring everybody in and start investing in this. And I think I'll also come back to you after we hear from all the other panel members to see maybe we already have a few of your solutions out there, if they could be applicable across various scenarios. So with that, maybe I'll move to our colleague, Mr. Sukera from the government of Mauritius. Mr. Sukera, as an island nation, exposure and risk to Mauritius is pretty high. And I'm sure there is no doubt in that. And there are various studies and analysis looking at it. Now, infrastructure would definitely play a key role in ensuring resilience, but this would also require regulatory changes. But would you see the critical infrastructure regulation in Mauritius adequately covering disaster risk, the current risk scenario, and the potential exposure that's going to happen in the future? If yes, could you give us a bit of an idea of how that's being addressed? If not, how do you think we go ahead and address it? The floor is yours.
Yes, Mr. Abhilash, thank you very much. And as well as Mr. Kuda, who has made a very good overview as far as African Bank for Development is concerned. So, to cut it short, we'll very quickly explain a bit on what our country their status is. And as you are all aware, the World Risk Report bears testimony to the vulnerability of small island development state to disaster risk. According to the 2021 report, 6 countries are unfortunately in the top list, whereas Mauritius, as you already mentioned, is classified as a high-risk island. It's a fact that our country is known to have outperformed other states in a number of aspects and looks back on a period of steady growth and economic prosperity. Mauritius took lessons from the past disasters, such as Cyclone Carol, which back in year 1960 killed 41 and left more than 100,000 homeless. Nowadays, disaster-proof architecture and up-to-date early warning systems have made our infrastructures and communities less vulnerable. According to the World Bank, from the year 1990 to 2020, we have invested considerably in the infrastructure sector. But we have to unfortunately acknowledge that development and urbanization has continued in risk-prone areas. In addition, we are increasingly exposed to the consequences of climate change, including sea level rise, high-intensity cyclones, storm surges, and flash flood, among others. Increasing disaster and climate risks are putting additional stress on our existing infrastructure and widening the infrastructure deficit. Again, when our infrastructure and disaster response mechanism were overwhelmed by the flash flood in the capital city of Port-Louis in year 2013, there was wide recognition to have stronger institutional and policy mechanisms, which would not only focus on response to disasters, but also to capitalize on the effective prevention and reduction of disasters. Continuing in this trend will mean that years-long growth may be compromised. Subsequently, governance, legislation, institutional and policy measures for disaster risk reduction and management have been put into place, including a disaster risk management ministerial portfolio, a center where I am, and also an app, and also a policy strategic framework and an action plan for DRI. So regarding to our measures taken, we have been privileged to benefit from the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI. Country proposal, it's an initiative from the government of India to carry out the following studies. It will be some national risk resilience assessment for our transportation sector, including roads, bridges, and right rate system, which we have recently implemented, the airport and the harbor. And we are also benefiting to have an assessment on our power infrastructure, an assessment on our telecommunication sector, and also will be benefiting through the CDRI on the fiscal risk assessment due to disaster-induced loss and damage. And also strengthening the capability of our academic institutions and infrastructure professional in disaster resilience factory. All these are at concept stage. The CDRI has already developed terms of reference to carry out all these studies, and we have been carrying out intensive consultations since the last couple of months, and CDRI is due to carry out these studies. And also, CDRI is coming with a new initiative called the Resilient Island State, the IRIS, and we have been privileged again to benefit from that study, where over and above the country proposal, the IRIS integrates the concept of gender and disabilities as well. So that's a bit for the time being, some sharing of information. I'm sure the questions will come at a later stage. So this was only the purpose of introducing what the seed islands we are undertaking in the field of disaster risk reduction, but focus on disaster infrastructure resilience. I hope that I've been able to provide some element of answers, but should there be any more queries, we'll be glad to share. Thank you, Mr. Abhilash.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anirudh. It was nice to hear from you. I mean, we can relate some of the challenges that you're mentioning about, including the scenario of a sea level rise and the potential exposure of Mauritius to some of these challenges. And it's also at the same time encouraging to hear and to know about the great work that your office and your ministry and the government is putting forward in addressing some of this challenge. I do have a follow-up question, but maybe maybe I'll first go with all the panel members, hearing them out first, and then we'll come back to have a bit of exchange and hear or take some of the follow-up questions. So with that, I'll move to my dear friend and colleague Michael Sudarakasa. Michael, Arise Africa has contributed extensively to addressing how to strengthen efforts and to promote climate resilient infrastructure investments in the region or in the continent. But you heard Ms. Toda mention before the financing gap in itself, right? The challenge that the sub-Saharan Africa faces. There are multiple efforts, I'm sure, on trying to address some of these issues. But through your work with the private sector network and through other affiliations that you have, how do you think the private sector can support in boosting investment in resilient infrastructure? And what do you see are some of the challenges, that's not letting the private sector actually do this in itself? Off to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Abhilash, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you for inviting Arise Africa to participate in what is indeed a very important topic. I think I want to frame the work that we've been doing over the last 2 years since we've had now a continental focus within Arise with colleagues in Kenya, our team in South Africa, in DRC, and an emerging network in Nigeria, working to really amplify the challenges, and many of them are climate change driven, but we also have man-made ones around conflict, But we're starting from a continent that is rapidly growing, and I think that's critical. In the next less than 30 years now, population will double. So that means our cities, and double from 1.2 billion to close to 2.4 billion people, that our cities are growing at a phenomenal rate. So there is a need to focus on more resilient cities in terms of the infrastructure that's there. In many instances, our municipal governments are being overwhelmed, to be frank. I think it's also critical that Atsuka talked about the importance of rural infrastructure, because still 60% of the population of the continent are in rural areas. We didn't talk much about the gap in electrification, particularly because only 600 million of the 1.2 billion people on the continent today have access to electricity, which means that in many instances, even if they have cell phones, there's times when they can't charge cell phones. And as you know, if there's a disaster, communication is one of the key infrastructural tools that one needs. So we're trying to raise the profile of the need for more resilient infrastructure. We started engaging the African Union of Architects, which is an organization that was formed in 1981, has members across the continent. So we start planning further. Right now, most of our corporations, and again, the challenge with the private sector as a resource in this realm on the continent is that close to 80% of the private sector are SMEs. And so they're just even having business continuity plans. They don't have them. So we're trying to get greater awareness. How would we do that? We've started with a formative network. We've reached out to the Coalition of Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, of which UNDR and ARISE are a part. We think that there are lessons learned from different parts of the world that can be very valuable on the continent. But we also want to reach out to the World Bank Resilient Cities program and see how we can tap into those, because a lot of the focus has been and is today on response after there's a crisis. And the whole discussion that we're having about disaster risk prevention and reduction means that you start earlier. So we need to find out, one, where are pools of resources that can be utilized to support activity before we have our crises, and also what's the value. I think that proposition, we're coming through, we're still in a COVID environment. So that has really focused the mind just to deal with the health challenge that is COVID. But we actually do need to be thinking about what do we do in the years to come. So institutions like Global Compact that have been around some time now, we're reaching out to because they have already in 9 countries on the continent formed leading companies that can help with this conversation. We intend to reach out to institutions like the African CEOs Forum and bring this conversation into places like the African Infrastructure Forum that the African Development Bank holds. Because to be frank, in years past and in the recent past, this hasn't been a point of conversation in the business conversations that take place on the continent. We have the Afro Champions organization that, again, these are the types of organizations that we want to have embrace resilient infrastructure, but disaster risk reduction more broadly, and bring that conversation to the awareness of the continent's CEOs. Atsuka talked about also PPPs, public-private partnership. For many private sector companies, the idea of supporting infrastructure is also new, because it's been really a public spend that develops infrastructure. So for example, if you're talking about agricultural value chain development, yes, there are companies who can see value there, but there are many other areas where we actually still need private sector investment and private sector support, where it's a newer conversation. And so we're also looking in the months and years to come to have public-private dialogues about this discussion. so that we see what methodologies, what modalities need to be put in place such that the private sector and the public sector can collaborate around DRR broadly, but in particular, initiatives that relate to resilience in the infrastructure space. We have rising tides. There are countries around the continent that will definitely be affected by raising water levels around the coasts. So that's something where we should be able to reach those in the hospitality industry who've built up around the coast. There are many different areas, but again, we've only started in the last 18 months, 24 months, and it's in this COVID space. So we anticipate that in the months and years to come, this will be much more of a common topic for developers on the continent and all the policy stakeholders who are needed to play a role as well. I'll stop there.
Well, thanks, Michael. That's very helpful. The facts and figures that you have put forward, but also some of the suggestions or the plans that you have for sub-Saharan Africa are definitely worthwhile in itself. I'm surprised to hear the contradiction in itself, where you mentioned that the cities will basically double in the years to come, and at the same time, 60% of the population is still rural. So there is a change in scenario that's going to happen more or less very soon. At the same time, we still need to tackle the basic services, electrification you mentioned. I'm sure then we also need to look at the access to water and health services, education, and so on and so forth. I do have one or two follow-up questions to you, but as with other panel members, I'll continue with hearing the other speakers and giving them an opportunity, and then we'll come back to you. Michael, you also mentioned a bit about the need of resilient cities and the Making Cities Resilient 2030 program. That's globally the largest program in itself, has been advocating about it, the need of resilience at city levels in the last 10 years, and the need of establishing long-term strategies. That also takes me to my next panel member, Ms. Zulu. Ms. Zulu, your municipality has developed a long-term strategy, right? A 2040 looking strategy, which has, among other objectives, the need of building a resilient city. Building a metropolitan open space system as a protection buffer, preserving valuable green infrastructure, promoting sustainable energy use, among other things. In particular, on infrastructure, your municipality aims to provide adequate resilient infrastructure for green placemaking and public transport, including on-site and off-grid plans to mitigate against costly and resource-intensive networks. Can you please describe the plans that your municipality has to invest in some of these infrastructure priorities that you're mentioning about? And how are you planning to finance some of these investments?
Thank you very much, sir. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Okay. My greetings to distinguished and eminent guests, Your Excellencies, partner organizations, and colleagues and friends. Yes, as a small municipality in South Africa, we are dreaming big. We are a secondary city. We are not a metropolitan, but we are planning as if we were a metropolitan. Actually, the municipality is working towards becoming a smart city. We have an overwhelming growth in terms of population on an annual basis, whereby our population grows at 4% due to the mining sector that surrounds us. On that basis, it means more people are coming into our town looking for job opportunities at the mines. But at the very same time, the mines are closing up in large numbers. So that leaves us as a municipality with a lot of dependencies in terms of people that need to be provided for through different services. So we therefore had to come up with a plan, hence the 2040 strategy, looking as to how do we keep ourselves sustainable, and in ensuring that sustainability, how further do we make sure that everyone feels safe in our town, they feel that they are protected. So we have, as a small municipality, further to that, created a network of CCTV cameras for all our main towns to make sure that we gather information, to make sure that our people become part of the resilience strategy that we are trying to bring aboard in order for them to participate in the protection and the safety of the community members. Further to that, we are building we are in a plan of developing a solar system that will help reduce some weight of the grid of Eskom. As you know, that South Africa is faced with a lot of load shedding due to dependencies on Eskom, which is further fueled by impacts of climate change as Eskom uses fuel services to create energy. And above that, we are looking at creating systems for waste management facilities that are diverting waste from the landfill. In 2001, South Africa took a pledge at Polokwane, we call it the Polokwane Declaration, to have a zero to waste system. For years, we've been working towards a zero to waste system, but we are currently getting there with the National Department of Forestry has currently revised the strategy to make sure that at least by 2022, most of the municipalities should have started working towards that. So as Steve Tshwete local municipality, we have started working towards that. We have developed drop-off centers for green waste, drop-off centers for general waste. We are developing different centers and transfer stations so that our waste is not hauled for long distances, and making sure that our emissions are also reduced as we do that. And further to that, ensure that our town is kept as clean as possible. We still have a challenge of illegal dumping, which cost us a lot of money to manage. But due to interventions like your drop-off centers, which are aimed to be 2 kilometers away from the households, and the underground bins that we've put at strategic points so that our community members can access them easily, e.g., for example, at the parks, when people are at the park, they can dispose easily their waste without having to throw waste everywhere. We are looking at reducing what we spend on cleaning illegal dumping, converting that expenditure to developing infrastructure, and furthermore ensuring that our institution and our community members take pride in the infrastructure that we develop. So in that doing also, we have just lately upgraded our integrated waste minimization strategy, which is more supporting activities that should be handled by private sector. If you understand the system in South Africa, is that minimization is not mainly the business of government, it's a business of private sector. So we are entering into triple P arrangements so that we make sure that they then take a lead in that space and ensuring that most of the waste and the facilities are funded by the private sector, not the government itself. Our focus needs to be on service delivery and making sure that we service our people at a higher level. Our mission as a municipality is to be the number one city in the Southern Africa, and we can't do that when we forever have other aspects that are not part of our mandate, but for which take our budgets out. Lately, we've done a feasibility study where we've developed we are planning to develop a material recovery facility. That feasibility indicates that we need a lot of money, like 70 million to develop a MERV. For a small municipality like us, that is a lot of money. Our studies further says to us, we need 170 million to develop another landfill site should there be a need. So when we look at that intervention against interventions of developing smaller infrastructures which are near community members, we found that the other option, the smaller infrastructures, were more feasible and they were more accessible to community members, and which further makes the community to be able to participate in bringing in the solution of ensuring a resilient response to disasters. Because what we've seen with waste lying around, it would block our water drainage systems, and further such drainage systems will block the rivers, and then we'll have flooding in our communities. And the people that are living in the low-lying areas will forever be affected by the flooding during the heavy rain seasons. So our interventions are looking at making sure that e-waste is removed from the system, especially, and another aspect would be your disposable nappies. So far, I've not heard of any state that deals with disposable nappies. I would like to hear that intervention, because we have a lot of babies that are born here and disposable nappies are everywhere, and we need to be dealing with that. And we, as I've said, the mines have closed down. We are looking at a just transit solutions so that we convert the old miners, the old mine workers, into other useful activities so that they keep on earning a salary, because municipalities depend on rates and taxes for them to survive. And if our community members are not earning a salary, it means then we are in trouble. We must subsidize them moving forward. Then with that also comes the challenge of acid mine drainage, which is one of the aspects that we still have to do a study on, to see as the mines are closing, is there anything dangerous that is being left on the ground that will affect communities going forward. So in terms of being resilient, we need to make sure that there is then infrastructure that will deal with such acid mine drainage or conversion of fly ash, in order to make sure that other people benefit from that. Currently, we have a cooperative that is dealing with fly ash, developing bricks and other materials, just to make sure that the fly ash doesn't become a nuisance to the community, but becomes a project that benefits the community members that are not employed at the current state. So with all that, we are having ICLEI South Africa, ICLEI Africa, and UN Habitat supporting us through different studies and making sure that all our services are rendered at a higher level, and they do the research for us in most of the time. And that would be me. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Zulu. I like your opening statement that we're a small city, but we are aiming to dream big. I think every city needs to do that in itself, dream big and be ambitious in itself. Now, since we heard you from a local perspective, from a local government perspective or a city's perspective, that conveniently allows me to go to my next panel member, my colleague from UNCDF, Ms. Sophie. Sophie, the previous panel member, as Ms. Zulu mentioned, have laid out some stark challenges, and she mentioned a bit about the challenge of when there's a huge requirement of 70 million versus 170 million on landfill projects that are critical, but at the same time, you don't have that kind of financing. You then go down to smaller projects in itself, but that does not rule out the need of those big investments to come in at local level. Now, interestingly, when you say local, it also abbreviates with the initiative that UNCDF has called local. This is the UNCDF facility for investment in local level climate resilience, if I'm not mistaken. I'll let you speak a bit about the facility in itself, but could you tell us how local can help local governments boost their investment in resilient infrastructure in itself? And I'm sure my colleagues would be glad to hear you on that, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Abhilash. So essentially, yes, the UN Capital Development Fund has, been working for the last, 30 plus years on various models of local government finance and municipal finance. And over the last 10 years, we've worked with countries to design, in a way, a new form of financing mechanism, which has been labeled, indeed, Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility. The first pilot started in Asia, in Bhutan and Cambodia, and since 2014 onwards, the instrument has come to Africa and actually has seen the biggest growth since then. So we are working now with 17 countries in Africa, helping them implementing or designing such a financing mechanism, and mostly with least developed countries. So over the years, this instrument has grown to become internationally recognized as a model to channel climate finance to the local level for local resilient investment. So we see this growing demand, as I was mentioning, especially in Africa, and it means really with this increased focus on integrating climate change adaptation, but also disaster risk reduction in the local planning and budgeting. And that was highlighted again, actually urged by the COP last week. So essentially local, just to explain briefly what it is, it applies the principles of fiscal decentralization and local planning and public financial management to climate change. So the instrument at its core is called Performance-Based Climate Resilience Grant. So it's a results-based financing instrument, which essentially provides a mean to ensure the programming and verification of climate change expenditures. The way it does so is by providing a financial top-up. So we know that infrastructure to become resilient might be faced with additional costs. So essentially, this type of financing instrument is meant to cover those additional costs. And so they are there to complement other forms of finance that local governments might have at their disposal. So the way it works is that the grants or the funding is channeled through the country systems so that it makes it scalable. So we can start with countries with a few local governments, but then go to scale. And we see it happening in Asia, where it started first, but also in Africa, with this kind of financing mechanism being brought to 20 districts in Mozambique, or with the plan in Benin to go to 30 communes with the Green Climate Fund, and then to cover actually the whole country. So you can have a financing mechanism that eventually channels every year in the long term, as it is resourced, the additional cost of making investment resilient. And we've heard from colleagues, drainage, energy, water, agriculture, transport. This mechanism is aligned with the mandate of local government. So it's not sectoral, it's multi-sectoral. And it means that every year the local governments can decide to invest in a type of investment that seems the priority based on localized climate information that have been produced. So we also think it's, and I think countries sees it as a long-term solution because it, in a way, utilizes various sources of project finance, often starting with bilateral funding, then also sequence with international climate funds, and or at some point also co-financing by the countries themselves or the local governments for that matter. And so the sequencing of aid and various sources, all using the same system, although tailored to the country, and then used at the discretion of the local government, is a way to actually consolidate gradually a system rather than switching from one project to the other. And that's what we observe in countries. So far we've mobilized 125 million, and it's essentially being used to get started in countries to help set up the mechanism and then fuel the first few millions in it so that it is consolidated. The end goal is that countries keep running it themselves to direct access, or at some point also reallocation of own resources when they are really a proven co-benefit in terms of adaptation, reduced risk with more shorter term socioeconomic objectives. So at the exit, what does it look like? We see, local government investing in transport, bridges, culverts, water provision, drainage systems, and it can work in both rural and urban areas. We've worked essentially in rural areas, but in a country like Senegal, where the communes are equally rural and urban, it's actually the same system that could cover all of them. And then it can cater for the smaller scale investment within the mandate of that lowest tier of local governments, and is, of course, to be complemented with the larger infrastructure that colleagues might have spoken about. So it's one piece of the equation, and under large demand as we see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Very helpful. I mean, if if I may, I would put this as more as a layered cake financing process where you have multiple layers of financing coming in to one big investment required, and the local in itself provides a sort of additional requirements, or it fills that gap when it's required. Since I have less than 8 minutes left, I'll take this opportunity to maybe put forward some of the questions that have been coming in. But then maybe I'll start with Sophie here. I mean, it's a very basic question. The financing that you're talking about that comes through local or the initiative in itself, these are majorly grants. They're not debts, to put it. Now, do you have come across any cases where when this financing gets applied, is there a pre-written set of criteria on how do you label that this investment is actually going to make sure that the infrastructure that's going to get invested is actually resilient or not? Are there any instances or cases like that? If you could, let's say in 1 minute, talk about.
Yeah, so indeed, I mentioned it's a results-based financing instrument. So every year, the local governments are assessed in an exercise that is called annual performance assessment. And that exercise is looking at whether the local government meets minimum conditions to access the grant. So that's essentially linked to good fiduciary standards and making sure that the funding is used for its purpose. Now, on the climate resilient dimension, we do work with local governments and countries to develop climate risk assessment that will use the territorial unit as a unit of analysis, so that the local plans can be risk informed. That is one way to actually help ensure that the whole planning is actually gearing into the right direction. Each investment is also to be justified, and that is checked also at least once a year to that exercise, justified with an adaptation rationale in this case. Of course, some countries look at also DRR at the same time, but a rationale. So each investment has to speak to the localized risks that have been assessed, local adaptation priorities, local development priorities, and have that rationale also linked with outcome indicators and output indicators. So that is a way to, through both technical assistance and this annual check, to make sure that the investment are actually strengthening the resilience and integrating the risk, also through the technical feasibility study of the investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. That was very helpful, and thanks for that. If I may, Michael, I wanted to go back to a few things that you had mentioned. You mentioned about the majority of SMEs, the 86% of the commerce or industry in Africa is still SMEs, and then that you are also exploring connections with other initiatives like the African Infrastructure Forum, the African CEOs Group, and so on and so forth. And now, the pension funds in Africa are also equally getting bigger and bolder in itself. Now, in most cases, we also see that the pension funds and the institutional investors or the asset managers in itself sit on those funds and take decisions where those investments should go on an infrastructure side, and so on. Is there a plan of engagement with them, or do you see an interest from the asset managers or the institutional investors in Africa looking at the issue of resilience and sustainability in those investments?
I think definitely you mention a important pool of resources that are underutilized for resilient infrastructure, but I would argue for infrastructure in general. There was an initiative about 3-4 years ago by what is now the African Union Development Agency, which formerly was called NEPAD, to have a 2% increase, just 2% allocation from, it might have been 5%, but I mean, basically a small increase from the pension funds to invest in infrastructure, which would have yielded billions more dollars available for infrastructure investment. Unfortunately, there was a challenge because what we have are very conservative pension funds. So, this advocacy program that I spoke about actually needs to also include further engagement with Africa's pension funds. because that money is not forthcoming at this juncture. But you're 100% spot on that those are resources that could be used. You have the impact investment community that is also reaching out to the pension fund community, infrastructure definitely. And so I think, though, because the private sector has often say, meaning that they have pension funds that are, you have both public and private, that perhaps the private sector could lead that conversation. That's why I'm saying that we see as Arise Africa this critical need to have more conversations about this with those who do have capital, and particularly focusing on domestic risk reduction, domestic resource mobilization to support this. Because again, historically, one has thought most of this focus should be just for the government. And so as we now talk about what the private sector can do, privately managed, controlled pension pools of capital definitely need to be engaged on this subject.
Thanks, Michael. Very helpful, and that's definitely a group of stakeholders or community that we need to further engage and work with. I just have less than 2 minutes now, but I wanted to put forward a question to Mr. Anirudh from the perspective of Mauritius. In multiple analysis that we have seen, there is this very limited data availability on disaster or infrastructure damages at country level, and also, and more so on the disruption of basic services. For at any point of time, the purpose of infrastructure is to provide that service. And if there is very limited data and availability of both, which is damage and the disruption of services, it's difficult to then decide on where the investment should need to go to, or which sectors are facing the challenges in itself. Do you see a similar challenge in your country, in Mauritius, or do you already have managed to address this issue?
Yes, Mr. Abhilash, this is a pertinent question. So, in order to bring some clarity in the points that I'm going to share with you, since I mentioned that cyclone in 1960, which hit Mauritius, following that, there has been a massive investment in the building architecture. If whoever has come to Mauritius since we were hit by the cyclone Paul in 1960, almost all our buildings are concrete, but it was based upon what we have saw. So since then, this has helped us in making progress so far. But coming back to your question on disaster statistics, which mainly relating to damage to our infrastructure, specifically critical infrastructure. For the last, I would say 20 years back, or even more, we have not been experiencing any major impact in terms of cyclone, a very intense cyclone making a landfall on the island. But if you will see for the open studies carried out in terms within the region, due to climate change, global warming, the intensity of cyclone has increased in the region of the Indian Ocean, where now they are gusts exceeding 320 kilometers per hour in a number of cyclones. So now the question is a very big challenge in photo. What will happen to Mauritius in case we are hit by a cyclone of that intensity? Because we have based ourselves for the last 30, 40 years to build our resilient infrastructure on a certain building. For example, will be able to withstand wind load of now. Due to climate change, this is no longer the case. So this is one of the biggest challenges. And coming back to the disaster statistics, for the time being, most of our buildings are resisting, are not affected, in fact, to all these cyclonic impacts of lesser intent. But the biggest challenge is other. So now we have also the issue of the multi-hazard approach. We, as a small island state, we are vulnerable to cyclone, flooding, storm surges, and these are frequent events every year. But we also are really slow at the sea level rise. According to they are working on a figure on 1.5 degree centigrade increase. So what will be the impact? But it will be a slow onset. And all our coastal facilities in terms of hotels, tourism, and economic, all our are found on the coastal area. So what will happen? So all these we need studies. From that, then we'll be able to provide both to the Sendai framework monitor and as well as the. Maybe these are some of the points which I wanted to we wanted to highlight, and also we'll take the opportunity to mention that because one port, only one airport, and what will happen for us as a smaller island in terms of resilience? We are affected by a very intense tropical cyclone. We have our road networks. They are more or less resilient, but still due to flooding during heavy rainfall, most of our important road network have a tendency to be flooded. We have also our power infrastructure. Also, we are considered resilient, but still due to the climate change and impact of very intense tropical cyclone, we are a bit worried. So otherwise,
thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mr. Anirudh, for those remarks. We have run out of time, but I would have loved to continue this discussion. I mean, very few quick takeaways for me at least was this, and hearing from all of you, there's this change in demographic that's going to happen in Africa, and the impact it may have on infrastructure, but also the investment that's required in itself. There's the other takeaway that I also have from here is, there's still a bigger gap in addressing the basic services and the basic utility services that's not been met, and in certain countries and certain locations, as Mr. Anirudh was saying, there's only one airport. What happens if that airport actually gets hit by a cyclone and it's not operational? That completely collapses the business continuity plannings or business continuity, or even tourism and the economic fallout and impact it has. I think we need to stress test infrastructure. I don't think we have done it properly. We are doing it. We have to learn from the banking sector, and we need to start stress testing infrastructure to a large extent to understand the dependencies, interdependencies, and where priority investments need to go in. We need to start also integrating resilience into the investment decisions. At the same time, there is still the gap of that financing gap, which also has to be met. And hearing out from my colleague Sophie and other initiatives out there, it's a gradual process, but we need to stop talking, and we need to act now. And to act now, we need to get the investors, the institutional investors, the private sector also to come in. And it's not about one way or the other. It's about the PPPs, as some of you mentioned, but also making sure that these PPPs are actually based on risk and resilience matrices in itself. At the end of the day, every infrastructure that's built or investment that's built, it's local. And in that, we need to make sure that local governments and the cities are actually resilient in itself. This is a very big topic. There's a big issue. I don't think we all can address that in 60 minutes window. But thanks a lot again for your time and being with us and putting forward your views and opinions. We hope to see all of you sometime in a face-to-face environment and cut down this virtual dependencies in itself. And thanks again. Have a nice day. Have a nice evening, and take care.